Okay, everyone. So in this lecture video, what I'm going to be talking about is what happens when you damage your bone in order for your body to fix it. So if I asked everyone around the room who has potentially broken a bone, I bet a lot of you will raise your hand, right? Right. It's very often that, say, you experience some dramatic change in or some trauma or something like that where a bone does get broken, whether that's just due to stress, like a stress fracture, or something more traumatic, like falling out of a tree. Again, some kind of instance where the bone itself is actually damaged and needs to repair itself. So one of the things that your bone has to do is actually modify itself so that it can actually bring in this heavy collection of minerals to repair itself and actually create something that's stronger to allow it to continue its function. Okay, so when we're talking about a break to a bone, there's one way we describe that as a fracture. So in general, if you hear that the bone is fractured, you might have heard someone describe it as a hairline fracture. It's where the bone suffers some kind of crack, break, a shear, like if it's broken at an angle, or what we call a stress fracture, which is micro, or smaller cracks inside of the bone that are, say, due to extra pressure, applied pressure, or often happens when the bone is weak, say due to something like osteoporosis, that causes damage to the bone overall. Okay, so there are actually two broad categories of fractures that we can talk about. If you take, say, one of these bones like your coccyx that gets broken a lot, like this guy, there are two types that can happen. So probably the most common type is called a closed fracture. And this is where the break is contained internally. So essentially the bone does not poke out from the skin. Sometimes you'll see doctors call this kind of a simple fracture, and the idea that you're only having, say, a clean break, like a complete split. So some kind of crack or break, less likely to be kind of a shear or a stress, which can be a little bit more complicated, but still technically simple since it doesn't, or closed since it doesn't extend outside of the skin or the muscle. Okay. Another type of fracture, which is much more traumatic, often called a compound fracture, is called an open one. So open fractures are when the bone actually sticks out through the skin. So like if I say broke a bone and suddenly like the spine is sticking out, right? Like that, right? That means that you're going to have some kind of very traumatic injury. Like this is a C2. And then what's happening here is that you're going to have the bone poke out. If you're really interested, there are images and stuff of that online. I don't want to show you in this lecture video, but if you're really, really curious, you can go out and find it. So there are other ways in which you can communicate how a fracture is done. So if you are talking about a transverse fracture, that's a fracture that's dividing the bone in half. So if say you're fracturing your rib, a transverse fracture would be one that's cutting the across a long bone. So you're breaking the bone right here in a clean fracture. A spiral fracture is when it's due to either twisting or torting the bone. So this can sometimes happen if you are happen to long bones. Being a child who grew up in farm country, right, a lot of fractures like spiral fractures or people breaking their arms were due to say getting caught in something, like people getting caught in a combine or something like that. And that's where what happens is you actually twist the bone and it causes the bone to crack along this edge here, kind of where all the pressure is. And those can be pretty traumatic and very difficult fractures to actually, to repair. Sorry. Another type of fracture that you might have, let me again highlight these so that they're a little bit easier to read. Comminuted fracture. So what these are where you actually take the bone and it shatters, right? It breaks into lots and lots of pieces. So that'll happen if you say, oftentimes you'll see this happen if say you're using a femur, right? And then if you're falling on it this way, it sends the pain up, or sends the crack up the bone in a length and breaks it into lots and lots of little pieces. Okay, so that's a lot harder for your body to repair because it's trying to bring back a lot of things. So ideally, if you're going to have a fracture, you want it to be a transverse fracture because those are easier for your body to repair. But you're not usually lucky to get to say how it's going to break. Okay, so again, in general, just keep in mind that bones are actually very good at repair as long as they have an intact blood supply, so that it's easy for blood to get to the bone, that the endosteum and the periosteum are still around and intact, because those are going to be the sources for the stem cells necessary to allow for your body to actually start building bone again. Okay. With a bone repair, as your body is working with it, it can actually take a while for that bone to actually heal. So The younger you are, the healthier you are. Obviously, the faster you're going to repair those bones. But to get like a fully repaired bone, it can take up to 4 months to a year for that bone to be completely healed. Most of the time, if you're wearing a cast, the doctor will have you in the cast for like 6 weeks. But again, that doesn't mean that the bone is completely and fully healed. Right? It can actually take much longer for the break to be completely removed, and not visible under an X-ray, for example. Okay. So let's talk about the steps it takes in order for your body to repair itself if, say, you damage it. Okay. So the first thing that has to happen is that your blood vessels need to somehow bring in materials for your fracture to first stop bleeding out. Okay. So when you break the bone, you're actually breaking a lot of things, right? There's a lot more inside of your bone than just what's going on with just like the actual matrix with the osteons and all of those things coming together. There's actually a big blood supply to your bone. So what ends up happening if the bone cracks is that you're going to form what's called a hematoma. Okay, so a fracture hematoma is a blood clot. Essentially what that does is it blocks the injury, it helps prevent other things getting inside, it provides a blood supply there, and helps kind of start bringing in the repair mechanisms you need to help your bones actually start repairing themselves. So that hematoma will form underneath the periosteum, to help fill in that break at the periosteum, so that it can allow a place for your cells to actually come and replace what's going on. Okay. So after your cells have, after that hematoma has formed and your blood has stopped leaking out of your bone, what will end up happening is the cells in your endosteum and periosteum will start to divide, and they'll start moving and migrating into that area. Okay, we form this area where the bone begins to thicken, and we call this a callus. So in our case here, we call it an external callus because it's going to be kind of on the edge where the periosteum is. And so what this will end up doing is begin forming chondrocytes and hyaline cartilage. So building the basics structures that we need to allow kind of then bone to be replaced on top of it. So remember when we talked about bone formation, it's through the process of changing cartilage into bone through ossification. Here what's happening is we're differentiating these stem cells that are in your periosteum and endosteum and turning them into chondrocytes, okay? And then chondrocytes are a precursor to osteocytes or bone cells, okay? So we have chondrocytes and hyaline cartilage that'll start forming in those areas. Okay, so once that actually starts forming, the next thing that happens is we have osteoblasts that come in. So again, this is very similar to what happens with bone formation, right? The osteoblasts will come in, they'll start forming spongy bone by ossifying and changing those calluses into this kind of, from this dense cartilaginous structure into what looks more like spongy bone, where you've got ossification, it allows for muscles to attach, and this is actually the repair process that then allows the bones to actually start functioning normally again, because up through now, it takes a while for your bones to actually start bearing weight, which is why, if you break your leg or something like that, you're put into a cast and you're told not to put weight on it, because if you put weight on it, it's only going to make it harder for the bone to form this callus structure that then can start to ossify as the osteoblasts go in. So remember, an osteoblast is a cell that's going to create or add bone. So up until then, right, this could be anywhere from a couple days in order for that hematoma to form, and then for that step 2 to start happening. Like here, we're probably at about 3 weeks after a break to maybe a month after a break, to where we can really start beginning to put additional weight on it, right, so that your muscles can bear the stress, and that you can actually start moving normally. And this is kind of towards the end where you're like, the doctor's like, okay, it's okay for you to remove it, and you can start not having your cast. Okay, so as those osteoblasts come in and replace that callus, what can happen then is that your osteoblast will start differentiating into osteocytes, right, to carry out additional function. And then what will end up happening is your bone will start kind of remodeling itself, so that now, instead of having this area where it's probably really, really dense, right, or in other areas, if the break is really loose, where it's really high in spongy bone, you either start depositing more, so it becomes more dense bone, or you'll have a place where we're generating more spongy bone. Again, it just depends on what's going on. But essentially, we're trying to return the bone back to its original condition, its original state. Okay, so what will end up happening here is that all of that dead bone will end up getting removed, and the cartilage will end up getting replaced by these osteons. So they'll be ossified and there will be calcium phosphate added to all of those places. But one of the kind of byproducts of this is that these broken bones are actually going to be thicker and denser than, say, what your original bone was. You might hear sometimes in training, what people will do if, say, they are doing martial arts, like if they're punching stuff, is that in their hands, when they're punching things with these, they'll start getting these micro fractures inside of these long bones, right? They'll begin to heal and it'll actually make your fish stronger, and that you're producing more dense bone because of the continual fractures. So your bone will get stronger in that sense, and thicker compared to what original bone was. Okay, so which is why in some people, especially as they get older, as bones repair, you can actually see areas where they're broken, right? Or a good x-ray technician should be able to see kind of where's the line or where's the location where you potentially broke a bone before in the past. Okay, so since we're at this fourth step where we're talking about bone repair and it being remodeled, I just want to talk a little bit more about what remodeling is in bone. So what that is as a kind of process and some things that happen because of bone remodeling. Okay, so bone remodeling itself, right? One thing to think about your bones as you grow is that your bones are not the same bones that you had when you were born, right? As you've grown since a baby that was mostly a cartilaginous skeleton, your skeleton is now much more solidified, right? It's a lot harder because it's made up of calcium phosphate. With this bone remodeling, as you grow and as you change, you're going to start changing parts of that cartilage into that stiffer bone, as you say, you're starting to walk, right? You're going to have to start bearing weight on your joints. So you need that additional support with the actual ossified bone structure. Okay, so bone in your body is constantly being turned over as you age and as you grow. So as you age, right, the bone is going to get replaced because, say, it's experiencing these slight fractures and maybe a little individual cracks and osteons, right? As you get taller or gain weight, you're going to need to change additional supports as you age. Okay, so we define remodeling as just the process of bone structure change due to osteocyte, osteoblast, and osteoclast function. So essentially the relationship between the three types of bone cells. So remember, an osteocyte is going to be like your basic bone cell that's going to carry out most of your daily function. Osteoblasts are cells that create. Okay, so they actually turn into bone and lay down the components of bone. And then osteoclast, a clastic cell, is going to be one that breaks stuff down. So this is what's eating away at your bone and making room for, say, blood vessels or for bones to come in, or will tear up old dense bone to create some additional form of bone, or if you need, minerals last minute because of something. So when we're thinking about what's happening with this structure, right, with the bone remodeling, it's going to end up happening, very rapidly. Okay, and again, because of stress. So like I said before, like with exercise, as your body is, say, putting more pressure on your bones, like say through running, even lifting weights, as your muscles get stronger, they start pulling on your bones more, right? So your bones need to be stronger to compensate. So your bones will actually become stronger and denser. This is why individuals who, say, are having osteoporosis or are having like symptoms of that or early symptoms of it, that one of the treatments for that is exercise, right? Exercise is a natural trigger for your body to start creating more dense bone. Okay, so over time, if you do not use your bones, right, if you're not moving as much, if you're not putting weight on them, your bones can become thinner and actually become brittle. Okay, so it's sort of like what happens with muscles, right? If you, say, start bodybuilding and you get really buff, your muscles get big, but over time, if you stop working out, stop applying that excess force, your muscles will atrophy and get smaller. Same thing happening here with your bone. If you don't use it, you lose it, kind of thing, right? So if you're as someone who exercises a lot, you're probably going to have denser bone compared to someone who doesn't. Okay. So there are conditions that actually exist that are relevant for our class, right, to think about motion and what kind of motion someone can do based on their bone structure. And one of those problems is called osteopenia. So this is what actually happens when your bone doesn't create enough ossified bone, right? As it's building and being remodeled, you're actually not creating enough bone to allow for your body to actually support what's going on. So this is a natural process. It does begin for every person, and it starts to happen around the age of 30 and 40. And as you say, generally become less, mobile in movement. You get older and your bone doesn't have to turn over as much because you're not growing. The activity starts to diminish. So your bone takes longer to repair itself. It takes longer for osteoblasts to come in to do stuff, and osteoclasts will continue to carry out their normal function. So if this is starting to occur where you don't have equal action between your osteoblasts and osteoclast, your bones can start becoming more and more brittle over time. Okay, so in general, as you get older, right, your bones become thinner no matter what. So on average, women will lose about 8% of their bone mass every decade. So every 10 years, your skeleton is going to weigh 8% less than it did before. So you think about that. It's an easy way to lose weight, right? Is that over time, as you just age, that's naturally going to diminish. Okay, men don't lose as much bone. Okay, so they lose about 3% of bone every decade. Again, that's just gender difference that happens between them. Again, men and women. So just kind of the rate in which you start slowing down and start losing bones. If you have kind of an extreme condition, right, where you're going outside of this range of loss of 8% or 3%, we have what's called osteoporosis. Okay, so you've probably heard of that because of all the TV ads dealing with, osteoporosis medications, like Boniva, things like that. But essentially, this is extreme osteopenia. So it's outside of what you normally experience as you age. Okay, so this is where you're losing more than 8% if you're a female, or more than 3% if you're a male a year or a decade. And it can happen very, very quickly. It often happens to females much later in life, mainly due to menopause and changes in hormone. But men can also experience osteoporosis. But it's rare to experience it when you're younger. Again, it's more likely to occur when you start hitting your 50s, 60s, 70s. Again, because your cells slow down, you're not replacing the bone material as quickly and rapidly. So you end up losing a lot of bone mass. So osteoporosis, there are some connections with families. So families with individuals with osteoporosis are more likely to have it as they age. But again, a counter to that would be to do or maintain exercise, right? To stay exercise, eat healthy, doing all of that can be a way to combat it or slow it down or even improve. Again, it's possible for osteoporosis to improve as long as you're making and taking steps to encourage your bone to replace itself and to actually repair itself. Okay. All right, so that's our basic overview of bone remodeling and what's going on. One thing that you have access to is a summary picture of kind of what's going on with the different steps in bones. So this is part of that packet I gave you. But again, just kind of a stepwise process of what's happening for bone formation and then kind of what happens with this swelled callus getting remodeled and removed over time. So if you've got questions about bone repair and bone remodeling, let me know.